Our scripture this morning comes from the very first book of the Bible in Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 31. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The Jabbok River flows west from modern-day Amman into Jordan through Israel towards the Jordan River. It's a pretty river, especially compared to a lot of the other ones in that region. It's only 60 miles long, but its waters are much clearer and much bluer than those of the Jordan that it flows into. It's not terribly wide, maybe about the width of the Akmolgi, and in parts there's vegetation that grows along the shorelines and the banks. But the terrain back up from there is like that of the rest of the region. It is dry and rocky and arid. It is at this river where we find Jacob and his family getting ready to cross and return to his homeland of Canaan. Jacob has been away from his family for nearly 20 years at this point. 20 years since he has seen his mother and his father, whom has since died. 20 years since he has seen his brother. And the last encounter that he had with them wasn't a very pleasant one. Isaac had gotten old, nearing the day of his death. He tells his eldest son, Esau, to go out into the fields and hunt game and come back and prepare a savory meal for him. If Esau does this, then Isaac will bless him before he dies. Rebekah, his wife, has been listening in on the conversation, and an idea strikes her. She has always favored her son Jacob over Esau, and she decides to usurp Esau and have Jacob receive this blessing from their father instead. So Jacob goes and he gets wool to cover his hands to make them appear hairy like Esau's. He even goes and puts on Esau's clothing so that he smells like his brother. He then goes into his father, and when his father asks who he is, he responds, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game so that you may bless me." There seems to be a little bit of hesitation on Isaac's part. He's not quite convinced. But with the persistent persuasion of Jacob, he finally resolves that it is Esau and blesses him. Now, some people, when they hear this story, they may think that this can't be blamed on Jacob, that it was his mother's idea and she pushed him into doing it. And it's true that it was her idea, but he was old enough to know better. Jacob could have stopped at any point, but he didn't. The prospect of gaining the blessing was too enticing, and he willingly played along. And of course, all of us know how this story plays out. Esau eventually returns home and learns what has happened and becomes incensed, along with their father. I imagine at this point Esau was really at the end of his ropes. This isn't the first time that Jacob has taken something that belonged to him. Back in chapter 25, Esau also returned from the field one day and was absolutely famished. He asks his brother for some food, but before Jacob will give it to him, he tells Esau that he wants his birthright. His brother is standing there right in front of him, starving on the brink of death, the text tells us. And all Jacob can think about is how he can benefit from the situation. In some ways, maybe we shouldn't be surprised by his behavior. I mean, he did come out of the womb grasping his brother by the heel, already chasing after him. His name even reflects his character. He takes by the heel. He supplants. Or what we tend to hear more now, the trickster. And Jacob lives into his name. After the deception of his father, Isaac sends him away to live with Laban, Rebekah's brother. And Jacob seems to live a happy life away from his family. He marries, then he marries again. He has maids and he has lots of children, and he accumulates great wealth. But he is still the same old Jacob, and he dupes his father-in-law Laban and profits from his deception. The men eventually seem to work it out, but in the process, an angel of God comes and directs Jacob that it is time to return home. And so he sets out for Canaan. When we find Jacob at the Jabbok, he has received word that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 of his men, causing him fear and panic. For all he knows, his brother still has a mind to kill him. But ever the clever thinker, he sends part of his wealth as a gift to his brother and hopes that this will appease him. But when we meet Jacob in our passage for today, he has not heard back from his messengers. He doesn't know if Esau has received his gift. He doesn't really even know if his messengers are still alive. And with all of this uncertainty, he sends his family ahead of him into the path of Esau, not knowing what will happen. After sending them and his belongings across the ford, Jacob finds himself alone in the night. But as soon as he finds himself alone, a man, leaps out of the darkness and wrestles him to the ground. We don't know where this figure comes from or why he comes. Some have tried to explain it that maybe Jacob was really just wrestling with his inner self here. Or others have proposed that maybe it was Esau coming to claim his victory when his brother was vulnerable and alone. Jacob cannot see his assailant's face, a fact that must have made the encounter even more terrifying than it already was. There are little details given about the wrestling match, only that they wrestled until the break of day. To wrestle through the night would have been an exhausting encounter. Any sort of physical activity that long starts to take a toll not only on your body, but on your mind as well. As the dawn draws near, the man with whom Jacob is wrestling sees that he has not prevailed. Out of frustration or a desire to end this thing once and for all, he strikes Jacob on the hip. Some translations say that he touched Jacob. But I think this is too dainty of a translation, because the force knocks Jacob's hip out of its socket. It's almost as if this stranger has been holding back, exhausting Jacob, wearing him down so at the opportune moment he can lash this final blow. Jacob now finds his own heels under assault. He can no longer balance on them quite so easily. His injury and its imposition are revelatory. The one with whom he wrestles knows that even wounded Jacob is tenacious. The mysterious wrestler reveals a concern for the coming dawn. Is the wrestler concerned about what the sunlight will reveal? Does it matter whether or not Jacob can see his assailant's face? The wrestler demands freedom from him. And most people at this point would have just cried out in pain and let go. They would have called their losses and submitted to the wound, but not Jacob. Even after his assailant has told him to let him go, he continues clinging to this stranger. His clinging doesn't seem to just be related to winning a wrestling match, though. Throughout the night, Jacob must have realized that this wasn't just a man that he was entangled with, that the person whom he has been wrestling may not actually be a person at all. Before he will let go, Jacob asks for a blessing. But the blessing doesn't happen immediately. Instead, a conversation over names begins. The assailant asks, "What is your name?" And he replies, "Jacob." He takes by the heel. He supplants. Trickster. His identity is revealed, but so is the stranger's. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Here it is, the revelation, or more likely the confirmation, that Jacob suspected. His wrestling partner has been none other than the God of Abraham and Isaac, the very one who came to him in a dream promising him blessings and descendants. Not only is God's identity revealed, but Jacob is given a new name, Israel, meaning the one who strives with God. Or more true to the Hebrew, God strives. Jacob also asks for God's name, but is not given one. Instead, he finally receives the blessing that he has been holding out for. And when he finally receives this blessing, it is not something he has attained by his cunning nature or by sheer force of will, like he has done in the past. The blessing comes solely as a gift from God. The story closes with Jacob naming the place Peniel, for he has seen the face of God, and he heads off into the distance as the sun rises, limping because of his wound. In many ways, Jacob may seem like an unlikely patriarch of the faith. He manipulates his brother, he lies to his father, he deceives his father-in-law. Whatever situation he finds himself in, he is always the number one priority. This isn't the type of person we imagine God blessing and promising progeny and protection and land, especially when he engages in a wrestling match with God. That's not how you're supposed to engage with God. Only heathens or critics or antagonists of the faith purposely wrestle with God. You're supposed to be obedient and submissive, right? You're supposed to be moral and good for God to engage you. But that is not the example that is laid out for us in this text. In fact, God never even admonishes Jacob for his past behavior, What happens here is really quite the opposite. Jacob may change his ways later in Genesis, but we don't get any sense of that in our passage today. What we get here is a man who is actively struggling and wrestling with the divine, and a God who recognizes that and calls it for what it is. The name Israel signifies what Jacob has been in the past and what he presently is, one who strives with God. It is not only Jacob's character, though, that is revealed in this passage. The wrestling match wasn't just one-sided. It wasn't just Jacob entangled with himself. God also wrestled. God clung to Jacob and wouldn't let go. God was just as engaged with Jacob as Jacob was with God. And God isn't playing some kind of game here. God actually struggles with him. Jacob's story is a good reminder for us that when it comes to our faith, there's not just one model that we have to conform and submit to. God engages all kinds of peoples and personalities, even ones who may seem unconventional or even irreverent by our standards. And for all of Jacob's flaws, he never pretended to be anything he wasn't. He wasn't afraid to get dirty. He wasn't afraid for God to truly see him and know him. And it is through the very act of wrestling with God that Jacob and God know each other more intimately. God experiences Jacob's tenacity firsthand, and Jacob sees God face to face. Jacob's story invites us also to wrestle with God, to encounter God with all that we are, to not hide any part of ourselves, to not pretend to be something that we're not. Like Jacob, we might not always know what the outcome is going to be, and we may walk away marked by the struggle, but in some way we also walk away assured that God is deeply invested in us. And if we are tenacious enough to grasp God and refuse to let go, I just can't help but think there is probably a blessing waiting for us too. And that is good news.